We want to go now to our own exclusive interview with Angus King, independent senator from Maine, who's just walked off the Senate floor himself. Thank you for joining us. What did you think of the closing arguments you just heard?
Well, it's hard not to just sort of be impressed by Adam Schiff's closing remarks. I don't care which side you were on. That was a powerful piece of lawyering. The thing I keep coming back to, though, Ari, is the precedent here. And, you know, democracy is unusual in world history. The norm is some kind of authoritarianism, dictators, kings, princes, emperors, you name it. And we're a 200-plus year experiment. And I think what's going on right now is a step toward authoritarianism. It's allowing an elected monarch, and that's really what the framers were worried about. That's why they put the impeachment clause in. There were people who said you don't need it because you have elections, but they said, no, you got to have some kind of check on somebody. And particularly what makes it even more powerful in this case is the offense we're talking about involves meddling with the election.
Right. Well, Senator,
in other words,
if
the election itself is the cure, but we can't trust that the incumbent won't, finagle the election.
Well, let me jump in,
it's
Senator,
not the
because
cure.
you are known more for your moderation and your caution than I think for your rhetoric. So to hear you say, as this closing argument is completed on this day, that you are concerned that the actions in the Senate, that the clearing, the sort of acquitting of what I've quoted Lamar Alexander called the Democrats having proved their case, that the president was shaking down a foreign country, extorting help with his reelection. You're saying you believe that puts the United States on a path to being at risk of becoming an authoritarian country? Tell us more about that, because I haven't heard you speak like that before.
Well, you combine that with Article 2, which is the kind of broad-scale, total obstruction of the process. How do you hold a president accountable? How do you, if a president can say, we're not going to share any information, any documents, any witnesses, we're going to block all witnesses, then the impeachment clause is essentially a nullity. Obviously, you can't convict somebody if they control the flow of the evidence. But also, I worry that it can be, the principle that's being established here, that it's okay to do that, will go over into the ordinary oversight process. You know, right. Benghazi, where the administration produced thousands of documents and all these witnesses. I just wonder, and listen, this isn't just about Donald Trump. In fact, I would argue, it is, but the real issue here is the next president or the next or the next or the next, because Congress has been committing slow motion institutional suicide for about 50 years. The war power, the power over trade, even the power of the purse now, appropriated funds the president can grab and use for some other purpose. And now we're talking about one of the major checks. And the framers knew that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's an ancient principle. Lord Acton, enunciated that over 100 years ago, and that's what the framers were worried about. And what we're doing is skewing the balance here. That really worries me. Yesterday, Ari, up in Maine, I had a listening session. I had 300 or 400 people come to an auditorium at Bowdoin College. The most poignant testimony, I thought, was from a high school civics teacher, social studies teacher. He said, I've been teaching for something like 28 years. I now wonder why I've been doing that. Does it mean anything? Do the framers, do all these things I'm teaching about balance and checks and balances and separate institutions of government, do they mean anything? It was very powerful.
Well, that's a sad statement that I imagine resonates with a lot of people, which is not to say that any politician is stronger than the great traditions of this nation, but is to say that a coalition of politicians who want to wipe out any checks and balances with the president not only in concert with Mitch McConnell on how to approach this trial, but on Friday night, we were covering it, and I was sitting here saying it's all rather brazen that they're waiting. The Senate paused, the body that you serve in was stopped and waited so they could get a party line vote that was acceptable to the White House dealing with the nominal defendant. I mean, it's really breathtaking. So with that, do you leave? I'm watching, by the way, to our viewers, Bernie Sanders, your colleague, stepping out. We know Senator Warren is headed to Iowa. He is as well. I mentioned that because it is such a unfolding news day. But what message then do you have for viewers watching, saying, okay, this is all pretty dispiriting, according if they agree with what you've said?
Well, Friday, I wrote on my Instagram post that Friday was the most dispiriting and disappointing day I've had here in 7 years. And by the way, it didn't end Friday afternoon. At 1 minute to midnight on Friday, the Trump Justice Department made a filing with the court on a group of emails that they conceded went to the subject of what the president was doing with Ukraine, but they refused to release them. They refused to unredact them. The idea, I mean, on top of everything else we're talking about, the idea of willfully saying we don't want to hear the facts, I was astonished. I wrote in my notes I said this up in Maine yesterday, I wrote in my notes on Friday as I was listening to the arguments, how can anybody vote against this? And I still am just astonished. I thought there would be a dozen Republicans who would vote for witnesses, because I don't know how you go back to home and say, oh, well, I didn't really want to hear those facts, particularly from that guy who said, I was there, I know exactly what went on, and I'm willing to talk about it.
Well, as you say, Senator, that other evidence, the ongoing questions, go back to what may be very hard for some senators to explain. If they say he did it, but we don't want to learn anything more, well, that raises the question, what if he's still doing it? What if he puts a hold on more money? I mean, you don't even want to find out, the senators don't even want to find out that, which, as you say, they have oversight responsibilities, presumably, to thwart.
But I asked a hypothetical question the other night, which, by the way, the White House didn't answer, of what if the president calls the prime minister of Israel, says we're going to hold up your military aid unless you come to the country 2 weeks before the election and accuse my opponent of anti-Semitism? I said, is that permitted? And they didn't answer it. And then one of my colleagues stood up later and said, I don't have a question. I want you to answer Senator King's question. And they still sort of danced around it. But interestingly, at the end, they said that would be wrong. But I don't know quite what the difference is between that and the case that we're dealing with now. I don't know where that line is.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you. You're speaking very forthrightly, and sometimes people don't want to sound too negative, because where does that leave you? But I think you're being honest in what is obviously a fairly set of harrowing premises that people have to wrestle with. Senator King, thanks for making time today.
Thank you. Glad to be with you. I'm sorry to be down, but I think we're headed in a very dangerous direction.